So, well, thank you for joining us. And for those of you out there in the audience just joining us, this is Dr. Paula Bontempi from NASA's Earth Science Division. And we're here to answer your questions about what NASA does for the environment. But let's kind of start out, if you don't mind sharing a little bit. I think most people may not even know that NASA does Earth science. I think people think astronauts, they think space station, they think, the Voyager probes, that sort of thing. So can you talk a little bit about the history of that and what NASA does?
Sure. First of all, thank you for the invitation to talk to you guys today. We're really excited about it. Yeah, so it's really funny. You are spot on. I mean, most of the time I go places and people say, "Oh, you work for NASA? What do you do?" And I say, "Well, I'm in earth science." And they say, "NASA does earth science?" And so NASA has a part of their mission to understand and protect our home planet for societal benefit. And we do this using the unique vantage point of space, which is
Hmm.
a Earth observing fleet of satellites. And we can look at the land, the ocean, the atmosphere, the ice, all the parts that are living. And honestly, today is also our 50-year anniversary. So we've been doing this at NASA for 50 years.
Hmm. That's fantastic. And when we talk satellites, are we just talking like cameras, or are there different sensors, or what are the kinds of things that you can tell about the Earth from satellites?
Oh, great question. It's more than just cameras. We might have started out that way, but we've really migrated. We can look at all sorts of different properties of the earth. We can look at the ice and how thick it is. We can look at the ocean and its temperature. We can look at the plants in the ocean. We can look at vegetation on the land. We can look at the atmosphere, the air quality. We can look right above the Earth in what we call the planetary boundary layer, or we can look high in the stratosphere, well into the atmosphere. We can look at weather. We can look at the cycling of carbon, storms. We support a lot of disaster response. So it's not just about the exploration of our home
Hmm.
planet, but it's also about supporting management of its resources and things like disaster relief. And we invest in all sorts of technology to do this well beyond cameras. We
Hmm.
have different types of instruments to look at different parts of the earth. They're active, they're passive, and we partner a lot with industry to do so.
Hmm. So one thing that was interesting when I was kind of preparing for this conversation is I saw that it's not just satellites that NASA uses as a platform. So can you tell us a little bit about other places where NASA has instruments and is doing this kind of remote sensing?
Absolutely. So we actually also utilize the International Space Station.
Hmm.
We have 6 instruments on the space station as we speak, looking at all different aspects of the Earth itself. So that's a very unique viewing point. We have our Earth observing satellite fleet, and then also we have a fleet of aircraft that also have instruments that look at different parts of the Earth, and of course at a different scale than we might see them from the global perspective of our Earth observing satellite fleet to actually what's on the space station. We even have ground networks of different instruments that allow us to do what we call validate the properties of the Earth that we look
Hmm.
at remotely. So it's all different scales together that allow us to create a whole picture of the Earth and its properties.
Got it. And what are some things that we can learn from satellites, from space, from all these different instruments that we couldn't learn, without, sending stuff up there?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I'll tell you a funny story in response to that. When we first launched a mission to look at the ocean, near and dear to my heart as an oceanographer, called Sea Whiffs, in the late 90s, some of the first images to come out of that looked at the dynamics of the ocean and the plants in the ocean. I took it into a seminar when I was probably in graduate school in the late 90s, and I showed this
Hmm.
picture of the dynamics of the ocean, the different colors in the ocean, and how that related to how many plants were there. And everybody sort of said, What's going on there in the ocean? What are all those crazy swirls and patterns?" And we said that's oceanographic. So
Hmm.
what it allowed us to do is actually all the things we read about in textbooks for so long about what we were sure was happening in our Earth system, in our oceans, on the land, we actually could see those patterns and properties and qualities of the Earth for that first time. And not only see it in a snapshot, but string it all together in what we call a time series to look at change over time. And some people think we explore the Earth in just the spatial dimension in a snapshot, but we can actually explore it over time by stringing all that information together. So the discoveries of what's happening with the ice and on the land and how the Earth is responding to a changing and varying climate have been really dramatic.
And what are some of the things that we've been able to learn about the Earth from space in, using that dimension of time?
Sure. So we've learned things like the way back when we discovered the hole in the ozone layer using satellites. We've discovered over time that enacting things like the Montreal Protocol have allowed the ozone hole to recover. And that hole has closed almost exclusively. We've looked at things like the Arctic ice cap and how it is at, it's got a certain amount of coverage and the extent of it and how that changes over seasons, but also is shrinking over time as the Earth warms. We've looked at things like on the land, how there are trends of it greening further northward. We see vegetation getting green going further and further north and south in response to a warming climate as well. And there's any number of discoveries like that that we've been able to see over time with our satellite data.
And one thing I'm kind of curious about, just because we're, in the middle of kind of this novel global pandemic, are there ways, and maybe there's not, but are there ways that the satellite and these observations can actually help and assist and provide some data that might actually be useful in managing the disease?
That's an excellent question. So first of all, let me say that there have been a number of satellite observations that have looked at and marked changes in air quality, particularly nitrogen dioxide, which is a major air pollutant. So as you know, what has happened in the global pandemic, which is such a tragedy, but we're all hopeful that the recovery will be soon, that we've seen people staying at home, so less people are commuting. There's less pollution, and what we've seen is a drop in the air pollutant NO2 in major cities all across the world. And we've been able to look at that in the US and elsewhere with the ozone monitoring instrument on board our Aura satellite, which is a time series back to 2004 when it was launched. And we've seen around Los Angeles and the I-95 corridor from sort of the Boston down to Washington, D.C. area, drops in that NO2. Now, it's hard to say that that's just a change in emissions, but it's chances are it's probably largely a result of people staying at home. So those are some of the things that we're able to look at in response to the global pandemic. The other thing I'll mention is that NASA, as well as many other agencies, have created an opportunity for researchers to come in and propose to us research ideas to actually look at the relationship of anything we can do from space with our Earth observing data and what's going on with the COVID-19 pandemic.
And one of the things about the NASA data is it's all public domain. It's free. Anyone can access it, right?
Correct.
So
yes,
and I know that's been the case for a while. So what are some interesting things that people have been able to do with the NASA data who aren't necessarily working at NASA? Like what things have other groups been able to learn and discern from the data that all these platforms have made available?
No, that's a really good question. So I often get to go into schools and talk to them about, what we do at NASA. And it never ceases to amaze me what kind of questions we get. We also do things like the Space Apps Challenge every year, which is the largest global hackathon on the Earth. And we had a reach of over 55 million on social media last year, where we actually pose these challenges to people and say, hey, do you think you could use Earth observing satellite data to track things like environmental factors affecting a global pandemic? Let's use an example from today. And all people who participate around the world will come in with these creative solutions that maybe our researchers haven't even thought of, but it's sort of, they take our NASA satellite data and the assets and they come up with these clever solutions to problems like that. And I've
Hmm.
seen them apply it to things like, if we wanted to collect all of the plastics in the ocean, how might we do it? If we wanted to do things like find a novel solution to why we have harmful algal blooms and why they're getting worse in the ocean, and people just come up with these really clever discoveries and suggestions.
So,
It's been an amazing ride.
yeah. So, you mentioned something that caught my ear, which is looking at plastics in the ocean. Is that actually
Mhm.
something you can tell, like from satellites, you can see the plastic?
Yeah, so there are always questions about whether we can do this from space. And only recently have there been a few research publications that people have started to look at whether there are changes in the color of the water or the clarity of the water related to things like microplastics. It's definitely
Hmm.
an emerging field. The other thing you can do is some of the large garbage patches and the central gyres of the ocean. People wonder if they're big enough to see from space. And this
Hmm.
question does come up from time to time. Some of the global observing satellites will have a resolution on a global scale of about 1 kilometer. So it's
Hmm.
not quite fine enough, but it wouldn't surprise me if some of the higher resolution, sort of smaller pixel size commercial satellites can't detect garbage patches and things like that.
That's really interesting. And your own background is as an oceanographer,
Hmm.
and it's kind of what got you interested. Have there been any recent advances with satellites? Or I know you mentioned partnering with industry, and I know there've been a lot of new satellites going up lately. Anything that's just personally fascinated you about what we've been able to learn about the ocean from space?
Yes. There have been, like, not that long ago, I had this discussion with a group of people about, like, if we had to sit down and identify our top 10 discoveries,
Hmm.
in ocean science from space, what would they be? And people, the first thing probably 20, 30 years ago, which is really, auspicious to discuss on our 50-year anniversary, is we took all the satellite data and we were able to have the first global view of what we call primary production. And you might say, oh my
Hmm.
God, what's that? So you have houseplants at home and they go through a process known as photosynthesis, right? Where they take carbon dioxide and light and nutrients and they actually produce sugars and things that they need for life. And then they give off oxygen. And this is very important because what do humans breathe, right? Oxygen. And so what we do is we were able to take all the information that's out there and have our first global view of ocean productivity, which gives us some insight into how much carbon dioxide could be taken up by ocean plants and how much
Hmm.
oxygen is given off. Now, that becomes very important when you have a rise in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and people start talking about how we might mitigate that.
Hmm.
So that was really like the number one oceanographer big discovery from satellites that we agreed upon way back.
Gotcha. So, in talking about some of the things you're able to observe about climate change, you mentioned the ice caps, and then you can see kind of plants growing further and further north.
Hmm.
Are there other things about climate change or changes caused by pollution or other activities that you can detect from space, and provide to policymakers so they can, hopefully stem some of these consequences?
Yes, it's a good topic. So we do at NASA in Earth Science have an applied sciences division, or part of
Hmm.
the division. And so what their job is to actually work very closely with the research community that we also support, and decision makers, policy makers, resource managers, people with real management responsibility at the local, state, and federal level, even internationally, and
Hmm.
actually take the NASA satellite data and some of the modeling work that we do in data products and transition it over to them. We also work very closely at NASA with our domestic agency partners to understand what they need to actually manage Earth's resources better. And we actually blend that into our mission planning. So what we're trying to do is plan our missions not just for understanding and exploring our home planet, but to actually collect the data that's needed by decision makers and put it into their hands. So we do that in areas like air quality, public health, disaster relief, and fields like that.
So we're now taking some questions from you guys out in the audience. And for those of you who are just joining the live broadcast, this is Dr. Paula Bontempi. She's from NASA's Earth Sciences Division. And we're taking your questions about what NASA does. And one question that we got from the audience out there was really how did you start in your career as a space scientist studying things? So what got you interested?
Yeah, good question. So my father's family are all commercial fishermen way back in history. And when I was in high school, I probably a little before then, I told my father I wanted to be an oceanographer, which horrified my mother because a lot of my father's family actually died at sea. This is a risk when you spend a lot of your life right on the ocean. And so my father said, well, I really want you to have a backup career. And he taught me how to drive a semi at 16. And thankfully, I didn't need that. I went on into graduate school studying biology and oceanography. And I spent a long time actually studying plant life in the ocean under a microscope. And I went into the satellite-based world because I thought the whole thing was nonsense. And the rest of it is sort of history, right? And so here I am working for NASA 18 years later as the Deputy Director of the Earth Science Division, and it's been a phenomenal ride, and the best is yet to come. I'm looking forward to the next 50 years.
So one thing that you talked about earlier was about some of the observations that you've made about reduced pollution and emissions because of stay-at-home orders and things like that. A member of our audience asked, is there anything that this actually might do for the planet in the long term, or is it really more likely to be more of a temporary blip in the grand scheme of things?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of the research that's underway right now during the quarantine period is really just observing the changes in pollutants like NO2, nitrogen dioxide, that's caused from like fossil fuel combustion and things like that. To actually attribute it to a reduced emission is sort of the next step in the research, because there are other things like weather and atmospheric circulation that can distribute and redistribute the NO2. Now, chances are, if I stop eating my pint of ice cream every day, I will lose some weight. So one could say that a drop in the NO2 emissions is probably related to the quarantine factor and less people commuting, but the research is underway to actually positively correlate those things. So the next step is really yet to come in our understanding, not just of things like air quality, but water quality as well. Remember, we're not on the waterways as much now either.
Right. So kind of a related question to that one is in terms of asthma and breathing issues, related to air quality, is that something that you've looked at to monitor? Like, can you give advice about people who might have asthma and things like that, and look at the NASA Earth data and maybe figure out, hey, maybe I shouldn't take the job in this city or things like that?
Yeah, good question. So there are definitely areas of the global world, right, where we know they're pretty heavily polluted. People in Los Angeles might tell you, yeah, this time of the year, boy, it's hard to go outside and go for my run, or people in Beijing or other places. It's just densely populated. There was a great article in the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago about certain areas of India that people were photographing the sky because they had never seen it before, right? Because of the pollution that's usually there. And so I think, what NASA is trying to do with other agencies and international partners is actually start to look at that long term, right? We're very thankful that we have the satellites that can give us information on atmospheric pollutants and water quality. Now the time is to string it all together and see how it's different from history. And that will give us some insight into those changes and maybe what's causing them. And that would give hopefully the policymakers, if it's related to them, some insight into perhaps management strategies for the future.
Got it. Thank you. Well, we have time for one more question, which I'm going to take from the audience because I think it's just relevant for everyone. And really, just from your perspective as an earth scientist, what are things that ordinary individuals can do just in their daily lives to help improve the planet's environmental condition?
The two things that I like to say, great question, are, try to get your food locally, and try
Hmm.
not to constantly eat things that have to be transported long distances. And the other, honestly, is to recycle. I know I grew up in an area that did not recycle, and now my husband and I go out of our way with our son, who's very conscious of it, to make sure we separate everything. And God forbid, you take a double A, a triple A battery and you're going to go throw it out, and you say, oh my God, no, I should recycle this, and maybe even think about rechargeable batteries. So small things like that seem
Hmm.
like really unimportant, but can go really far, when people all band together and try to adapt some of those practices.